Okay, this is the Intersectional Paradigm, an alternative visions to stopping domestic violence. What poor women, women of color, and immigrant women are teaching us about violence in the family, by Natalie Sokoloff from Race, Class, and Gender, 10th edition. Okay, so the article uses the term domestic violence, which is often referred to in more modern literature as intimate partner violence. So I will use both terms, sticking to her terminology when I think it's most appropriate, but I want to clarify the terminology so that there isn't any confusion. So the article examines how poor women, women of color, and their allies are working against domestic violence in U.S. communities that are marginalized by race, class, gender, sexuality, and immigration status. An intersectional domestic violence approach challenges gender inequality as the primary factor for explaining domestic violence. Gender inequality is neither the most important or the only factor that's needed to understand why and how violence takes place against women in their homes. So gender is important, but it's only one factor. When you look at it from a race, class, and gender approach, this approach seeks to give voice to marginalized women while focusing on multiple interlocking oppressions. The structural perspective requires analysis and criticisms of existing systems of power, privilege, and access to resources. So Sokoloff argues that an intersectional analysis must draw from both approaches, both the race, class, and gender approach and the structural perspective, because women's voices must be situated within the social structure of their lives. Okay, so how an intersectional analysis can help to understand marginalized women's experiences of intimate partner violence. So while intimate partner violence, or IPV, affects all groups, all classes, all races and ethnicities, all genders and sexual orientations, we still need to understand that poor women of color are the most likely to be in dangerous intimate relationships as well as dangerous social positions. And failing to acknowledge this in the anti-domestic violence movement compromises the potential transformational or ability to challenge the issues of violence, as well as the multiple oppressions of poor women of color, which jeopardizes the validity or legitimacy of the anti-domestic violence movement. So there is a diversity among women when it comes to the prevalence, type, and impacts of intimate partner violence. Some research shows that Black women are abused with severity and are murdered at higher rates than other women. But Sokoloff argues that context is key, so violence needs to be contextualized instead of falling for the culture of violence arguments, where culture is blamed for violence against women. If research on IPV is done with a structural framework that looks at socially organized systems of social inequality, using this approach, when you control for income and marital status, you find that Black women are actually less likely than white women to be battered. Also, when using this structural framework, you see that neighborhoods are a significant factor. Neighborhood is a more effective predictor of domestic violence than race or ethnicity. So because of societal racism, we have very segregated communities by race. 75% of African Americans who are poor live with other poor Blacks, while only 25% of poor whites live with other poor whites. They often live in more mixed communities with working class people, so that means they have access to more resources for victims of violence. In criminology, the term collective efficacy refers to the ability of members of a community to control the behavior of individuals and groups within their own community. Control of people's behavior allows community residents to create a safe environment. The level of collective efficacy in a community can be related to domestic violence, as women in greater collective efficacy are more likely to inform others of their abuse, and that will lead to greater levels of support for those women. But it's the lack of good jobs, decent education, livable housing, decent health care, and good child care that can often create conditions where community members do not feel up to protecting their neighbors, including women in their homes. Okay, moving on to how an intersectional analysis challenges stereotypes of marginalized communities and their cultures. Too often, people blame racial and ethnic communities' cultures for violence. White society likes to pretend that violence only takes place in minority ethnic communities, which leads to stereotyping battered women from other cultures, or looking at how our culture ignores and promotes misogynistic ideas that often protect abusers and batterers. So the reading compares dowry deaths and U.S. gun violence, illustrating how dowry murders are terrible and need to be addressed, but in society we use an ethnocentric lens. that ignores the parallels of patriarchy and the violence that also takes place in our culture, such as the staggering number of gun deaths in the U.S., many of which are domestic incidents, where someone kills their spouse, parent, or child than themselves. Or the fact that women are most likely to die by homicide in the workplace, as exes and partners or other deranged men kill them at work, like the man who killed all those people in the beauty salon in Seal Beach, who was there to confront his ex-wife about a custody dispute and killed 8 people, including her. So how do we ignore the parallels and blame culture in a white supremacist way? And more, by doing this, we make violence more possible, more normalized, and attach it to racist notions instead of confronting violence against women as the real issue. In the U.S., safety for battered women and their children is typically premised on the idea that she's going to leave her abuser. Of course, men are also victims of IPV, as are same-sex communities, but this article is largely focusing on IPV and heterosexual relationships. So we know that most women do leave their abuser, but it takes an average 7 attempts before she can leave and be safe. That the most violent and dangerous time for a woman is just before, at the point of, and just after leaving is a reality that we often ignore. And then we blame women for being in violent relationships, instead of seeing the social culpability of not giving her an easy way to leave and be safe. So if she chooses to leave, she needs a strong shelter system or other support throughout the first year of leaving. But leaving also means turning to outsiders, which can mean facing a lot of hostilities depending on her own marginality. Also, leaving an abuser often means leaving their own community. So the stereotype of marginalized groups of battered women leads to major misunderstandings about what might help women in their struggles to be free from violence. So often the approaches are incarcerating men or taking away those economic contributions to her and her children, which is often counterproductive in many communities, meaning calling the police can backfire. And when we ignore this analysis and focus on blame and punishment, we lose focus on the social structural change that's necessary for violence against women to actually stop. Right? There's also the issue that discrimination in the criminal justice system is deep and profound. So that means some women are not going to see the system as a place to help them, right? Women in various communities of color may not feel comfortable calling the police or may feel that the criminal justice system isn't going to help, it's going to punish, right, or make their problems worse. So, for example, many immigrants experience police harassment or surveillance in their communities, which then leads people to fear police and worry about the threat of arrest or deportation, which can then affect whether or not they turn to police in situations of violence. So when the domestic violence movement doesn't account for these realities, they can cause more harm than good by advocating to call police or for longer, harsher criminal punishments, which aren't going to help certain communities. Okay, so community-based models of social justice, community engagement, and community accountability. Communities who have faced prejudice from police have developed an important movement with the goal to develop a community capacity to mobilize and organize against and assume accountability for changing violence against women in the community. Most batterers are never seen in the criminal justice system. This is the reality, even in the best of circumstances, right? So they cite Andrea Smith, who suggests that strategies must deal simultaneously with the reality of structural as well as state violence, especially state violence in the criminal justice system. So Smith is quoted as saying that the challenge that women of color face in combating personal and state violence is to develop strategies for ending violence that do assure safety for survivors of sexual or domestic violence and do not strengthen our oppressive criminal justice apparatus. So we can keep creating culturally competent services, but without large-scale structural changes, problems will persist. Intimate partner violence is part of larger social systems of violence and inequality. So intimate partner violence must be attacked at its root causes, the socially structured systems of inequality of race, class, gender, sexual orientation, immigration status, among others. Okay, safety and justice for all. So in the reading, they talk about some of these alternative approaches, one of them coming from the MISS Foundation that developed community responses, which the reading argues should be researched and explored, such as community squads to intervene with batterers, alternative 911 services that rush community members to a crisis scene, community groups overseeing children's safety, alternative accountability such as restorative justice, popular education through alternative means like music and street theater, and men teaching men about domestic violence and how to challenge its destructive forces. Other research argues that empowering marginalized women to become their own advocates and to organize against violence against women in their own communities, as they are the ones who know the most what resources are needed. So, a final note on the importance of macro and micro structural and economic change. When it comes to the micro level, criminal justice system responses can't protect women from re-victimization, as the system does not address women's underlying economic, social, and political disadvantages. So, on a micro level, it can't help protect someone because it's not doing the macro level work of changing those structural inequalities, right? So it's more effective to reduce violence and empower women, providing support like affordable housing, job training, and job opportunities, as well as affordable childcare and other social services. So in summary and conclusion, the author asks these two questions, which are really interesting to kind of reflect on, right? So the first kind of reflection is, what might it look like if communities had the resources to explore effective intervention that kept decision-making power within the communities and made it possible for women to stay? Like, what would that look like? What would those resources look like, right? And the second question was, where might we be if government accountability did not aim its efforts on criminal legal punishment, but instead centralized responsibility for basic needs and human dignity and affirmed human rights of all?